Hey everyone, Nigel and Luke here, and welcome to Crime Zone. Though it's been a little while, we thought this week would be a perfect opportunity to bring you the next list in our series of videos focusing on infamous murder cases from specific cities. Today, we will be tackling another of America's largest cities, with this list taking us to Chicago. Just like the cities we covered previously, Chicago is a place with a lot of history, and with that in mind, we have tried to choose our cases accordingly. A bit of a disclaimer, we have widened our scope to include cases within the entire Chicago metropolitan area to ensure that we could get the best mix of stories. Before we get to our list, don't forget to like and subscribe to Crime Zone for more true crime content like this, making sure to hit the notification bell to stay up to date with our latest videos. With that out of the way, here are 10 infamous Chicago murder cases.
Though we've covered the Chicago Tylenol murders a couple of times in other videos on our channel, we decided to include it again because no list of infamous Chicago murders would be complete without it. The implications for both the city and the country were huge, and had ripple effects that would change consumer protections and packaging of many goods forever. In the fall of 1982, a series of mysterious deaths started to happen in alarming succession in the Chicago area. First was 12-year-old Mary Kellerman of Elk Grove Village. Next was a postal worker named Adam Janis, followed by his brother and sister-in-law. 3 more fell ill and died within the following days. The common thread between the deaths was quickly discovered. All of the victims had taken extra-strength Tylenol shortly before their deaths. When tests were carried out on Tylenol bottles belonging to the 7 people, it was discovered that they all contained highly lethal amounts of the chemical potassium cyanide. The discovery led to a nationwide panic over the safety of off-the-shelf pharmaceuticals. Thankfully, police were quickly able to determine that they were likely dealing with a single culprit and were able to rule out the manufacturers. This was because though the bottles came from different pharmaceutical manufacturing companies, the deaths were still concentrated in a single geographic area. However, this still meant that the perpetrator had managed to add cyanide to the bottles and return them to the store shelves completely undetected, possibly over a period of weeks. Even more disturbingly, there was no way to guarantee that investigators had found the last of these poisoned Tylenol capsules. Warnings were quickly issued by the media. Police drove around neighborhoods in Chicago advising people over loudspeakers to throw out the possibly contaminated medication. Tylenol's parent company, Johnson & Johnson, issued a nationwide recall of Tylenol products, removing an estimated $100 million worth of product from store shelves in the process. While police worked hard to find the person responsible for the crime, there was little in the way of leads that could point them to the culprit. Though a ransom letter demanding $1 million from Johnson & Johnson to put a stop to the attacks initially seemed like a major break in the case, it turned out that the man behind it lived in New York and was likely just trying to capitalize on the fear. After that, police considered at least 2 additional suspects, but no one was ever charged with the poisonings. Perhaps the darkest fact of all about the Tylenol murders is that it inspired hundreds of copycat crimes immediately following the incidents in Chicago. This led to several more deaths in the following months and years, as people moved on from Tylenol and began to tamper with many different medications. Unlike most of the crimes on today's list, there is a small silver lining to the aftermath of the Chicago Tylenol murders. The incident prompted both companies and regulators to take consumer protections much more seriously, particularly when it came to the design of product packaging. In the years following the murders, tamper-resistant packaging became the norm, and features like child-proof lids, induction seals, and improved quality control were added to many products to protect the public from similar attacks. The 1983 Tylenol bill also made product tampering a federal crime in the United States. Unfortunately, the identity of the perpetrator behind the infamous Chicago Tylenol murders remains a mystery to this day.
Though you may not recognize the name Harry Kalstead, we're willing to bet you've heard of the musical Chicago. The world-famous Broadway show, which was adapted from a play of the same name, was inspired by the life of Kalstead's suspected killer, a woman named Beulah May Annan. Annan was born under the maiden name Sheriff in Owensboro, Kentucky in 1899. After divorcing once before the age of 20, she married again and went to Chicago with her second husband, Albert May Annan, in March of 1920. It was here that she would meet Harry Kalstead while working as a bookkeeper. The two eventually became romantically involved, reportedly taking long walks together and bonding over their mutual love of alcohol. But on April 3, 1924, their apparent whirlwind romance would come to an end, when during an argument, Annan shot Kalstead in the back. The exact cause or sequence of events of the shooting are unknown, in large part because of how many times Annan changed her story. At first, she confessed to murder. Then she changed her story to self-defense, saying that both she and Kalstead had reached for the gun on her bed at the same time, and that she had simply gotten there first. Annan's guilt or innocence seemed to fluctuate wildly depending on which version of the story she felt like telling at the time, sometimes saying she had shot Kalstead because she feared she would be raped, other times saying that she shot him in a rage after he told her he didn't want to see her anymore. Bizarrely, Annan's husband Albert stood by her throughout the court proceedings, and she was eventually acquitted of the crime. Based on the reporting available from the time period, it seems highly likely that Annan's acquittal had little to do with the evidence presented at trial, and far more to do with the fact that no one believed such an attractive young woman could be behind such a brutal murder. Indeed, this is one of the many things that the writer of Chicago, Maureen Dallas Watkins, would draw attention to in her play when creating her character based on Annan named Roxy Hart. Watkins was a reporter for the Chicago Tribune at the time and covered Beulah Annan's case extensively. Annan's bizarre behavior only continued after she was cleared of murder charges, announcing just the day after her trial had concluded that she was leaving her husband because he was, quote, too slow. She eventually divorced him, marrying twice more before her death at 28 years of age, from tuberculosis.
Despite the fact that it could be one of the largest active serial killer cases in the country, surprisingly little is known about the murderer named the Chicago Strangler. The killer is thought to be responsible for the unsolved murders of as many as 55 women in the southwestern Chicago area between 2001 and 2018. The victims of the suspected serial killer range in age from 18 to 58 and have predominantly been sex workers, had addiction issues, or have otherwise had encounters with the justice system. As the killer's macabre name suggests, the victims all died via asphyxiation, with some being sexually assaulted or beaten beforehand. Another hallmark of the crimes is how most of the victims had been found, out in the open in vacant lots or abandoned buildings, with little or no attempt to cover up the killings. While police have been slow to accept the idea of a serial killer preying on women in the city, they have stated in recent years that they believe it is unlikely that all 55 murders were committed by individual attackers. The evidence of this seems likely when considering years like 2018, where a number of these similar strangling cases happened in rapid succession. Those that support the theory of an individual serial killer point to other cases such as the Cleveland Strangler, as well as the most prolific serial killer in American history, Samuel Little, as evidence of how a killer in Chicago could continue to operate for so long. Still, the dark truth is that the notorious Chicago Strangler might actually be the work of several different killers.
Though whether this counts as a murder per se is in the eye of the beholder, John Dillinger's last stand against police is certainly one of the most famous killings ever to take place in the city of Chicago. And since this is a mob case that we haven't actually covered on our channel yet, we decided to include it on our list. Dillinger is one of the most famous Depression-era mobsters ever to have lived. Indeed, the creation of the FBI itself owes partial credit to the notoriety of Dillinger and his gang. Like many mobsters, Dillinger's trouble with the law began early in life. As a teenager, he was known for fighting and petty theft, though he quickly graduated to more serious crimes, such as stealing cars and armed robbery. It was while serving an 8.5-year sentence for the latter crime that Dillinger really began to delve deep into the criminal lifestyle. While incarcerated, he befriended seasoned bank robbers and decided that this was the route he would take upon his release. After being paroled in May of 1933, Dillinger robbed a series of banks in Ohio and Indiana in rapid succession, and found himself back in police custody by September. This was short-lived though, as he escaped from prison just days after being captured. The cycle repeated itself once more after Dillinger robbed more banks, was captured again, and again escaped after being sent to prison. After several violent close calls with police, Dillinger eventually made his way to Chicago, where he found the bustling city an easy place to blend in, despite the fact that it was also the center of the operation to capture him, organized by the Bureau of Investigation, headed by J. Edgar Hoover. In July of 1934, Hoover's task force got a lucky break, when Dillinger was betrayed by a brothel owner he knew who gave up his whereabouts in exchange for protection from deportation. She told the government agents that Dillinger would be at a movie theater on the 22nd of July, either the Biograph or the Marlboro. Tired of being evaded by the mobster, the Bureau sent police officers and federal agents to both theaters. As soon as Dillinger exited the Biograph Theater at approximately 10:30 p.m., he was ambushed. Accounts differ about whether he was able to remove his own weapon or not, but what we do know is that he was cornered in an alleyway and shot 4 times, with the fatal bullet entering his neck and exiting just under his right eye. Media reports at the time say that people were seen dipping their handkerchiefs into blood at the scene as souvenirs. The shooting was ruled a justifiable homicide by authorities, and at least one of the agents involved received a personal commendation from J. Edgar Hoover. In the decades since his death, Dillinger's story has been immortalized in numerous films, TV shows, and books, making it one of the most famous killings ever to take place in the city of Chicago.
In the early 1980s, a group of men stalked the streets of Chicago, abducting, attacking, and killing as many as 18 women. The list of sadistic and brutal behaviors the men engaged in during these crimes runs the gamut of human depravity, involving everything from satanic rituals to cannibalism and necrophilia. But what the men became best known for is the way that they mutilated the breasts of their victims, cutting or amputating them with knives or lengths of piano wire. Those responsible for the unthinkable crimes became known as the Ripper Crew, or the Chicago Rippers. The first known victim of the Ripper Crew was 28-year-old Linda Sutton, who was abducted while walking by the heavy tourist area near Wrigley Field on May 23, 1981. Her body was discovered 10 days later in the lot behind a seedy motel. Sutton's hands were handcuffed and her mouth was gagged. There were ample signs of sexual assault. But perhaps the most disturbing thing of all about the crime scene was how badly Sutton's body had decayed, given how recent her death was. The grisly explanation for this turned out to be the amputation of both of her breasts, at least one of which had happened while she was still alive, which had accelerated the decomposition. It was only the beginning of the horrifying discoveries to come. Over the next few months, the remains of many more would be found, mutilated and tortured before their deaths in a similar fashion. Curiously, at least 2 of the Ripper's crew's victims were left alive. There was no question that the crimes were related, as the injuries the women sustained were totally consistent with those of the murdered women. It was details provided by Beverly Washington, the Ripper Crew's final victim, that ultimately led to the men's identification and arrest. Washington described a harrowing ordeal to police. After being convinced to get into the men's red Dodge van, she was forced into the back, handcuffed, and sexually assaulted. She was then drugged and remembered seeing a length of cord being held by one of the men shortly before she passed out. The cord was later used, along with a knife, to mutilate her body before Washington was dumped near some railroad tracks in Humboldt Park. Washington's description of her attackers and their vehicle led police to 4 men, Robin Gett, Edward Spritzer, and Andrew and Thomas Kokoralis. After the arrests, all of the men but Gett eventually confessed to their crimes. In a series of truly horrific admissions to investigators, the men described how they had abducted their victims and taken them back to the attic of Gett's house, a place they referred to as their satanic chapel. There, they would engage in the mutilation of the women, engaging in cannibalism and necrophilia with their body parts while Gett read from the Satanic Bible. At trial, the men received sentences ranging from life in prison to the death penalty, though the only one ever to be executed was Andrew Kokoralis. While Gett and Spritzer remained behind bars, Thomas Kokoralis was eventually released from prison last year after serving half of his 70-year sentence. The release was understandably the cause of significant controversy in Illinois, with the state ultimately saying that they had no legal way of preventing his release.
Though it is unlikely that H.H. Holmes was actually the first person in America to murder in a way that could be defined as serial killing, he is widely considered to be the nation's first serial murderer. However, this is far from the only part of Holmes's record that is disputed. Everything from the number of his victims to the grisly details of his so-called murder castle tends to vary depending on who is giving the account. Still, the crimes of H.H. Holmes undoubtedly remain the subject of widespread speculation and fascination, and are certainly among the most infamous ever to take place in Chicago. Holmes was born to strict Methodist parents in Gilmanton, New Hampshire in 1861 by the name Herman Webster Mudgett. Differing accounts of Holmes's life start with his childhood, with some believing he may have abused animals from an early age and suffered from abuse at the hands of his father, while others find no evidence of either of these things occurring. What we do know is that by 1884, he had graduated from the University of Michigan's Department of Medicine and Surgery, and had already started exhibiting criminal behavior in the form of fraud and insurance scams. These scams would remain a feature of his crimes as he began to murder his victims. When he arrived in Chicago in 1886, he officially started using the name H.H. Holmes, and began working at a drugstore, which he later purchased. A year later, he began construction on the World's Fair Hotel, the building which would also infamously become known as the Murder Castle. Though called a hotel, the building actually consisted of storefronts on the first floor and apartments on the second floor. The so-called Murder Castle is responsible for much of the myths surrounding Holmes. The most sensational of these stories suggest that he would lure victims into the building, which featured soundproofed rooms and maze-like hallways, and then kill them. Chutes in the room supposedly led to the basement, where vats of acid and a crematorium waited to help Holmes dispose of the bodies. Though many of the bizarre accounts of the building's construction appear to be true, there is little evidence that Holmes ever killed people in this manner. Rather, it is believed that many of his victims were people he knew, many of whom were women. Indeed, of the cases that we know the most about, the victims were almost exclusively women who worked for Holmes in his building or who had otherwise had affairs with him. This includes women like Julia Smythe, who disappeared along with her daughter after moving into the World's Fair Hotel and began working at Holmes's pharmacy. Sometimes these women were also the victims of Holmes's fraud schemes, as was the case with Minnie Williams, an actress who was persuaded into transferring the deed of her home to the serial killer. Just like Smythe, Williams disappeared along with her sister under mysterious circumstances, just a few months after the paperwork for her house was finalized. However, the only murder for which Holmes was officially convicted was the killing of his accomplice and illicit business partner, Benjamin Pitzel. After the pair concocted a plan to defraud an insurance company by faking Pitzel's death, Holmes decided to actually kill him and collected the payout. He was finally captured and put on trial in October of 1895 and was ultimately sentenced to death. After his conviction, it was clear to investigators that Holmes was guilty of several more murders, including the killing of some of Pitzel's children. Holmes would ultimately confess to a total of 27 murders, though some of these people actually turned out to be alive. It is likely impossible to know the true number of people Holmes killed, with estimates ranging from 9 all the way to 200. This is almost certainly as much the fault of the press at the time as Holmes himself, who were happy to inflate Holmes's legend in order to sell sensational stories. These accounts would only grow more wild with the following decades, leaving us with the murky record that we have now. Holmes was executed on May 7, 1896, putting an end to the reign of one of Chicago's most notorious killers, once and for all.
The brutal murder of 8 student nurses in a single night in 1966 is remembered not only as one of the most infamous cases in Chicago, but one of the most horrific mass murders in American history. On the night of July 13, 1966, a man named Richard Speck broke into a townhouse in Chicago's Jeffrey Manor neighborhood, armed with a knife and a gun. At the time, the building was serving as a dormitory for nursing students at the South Chicago Community Hospital. Speck proceeded to knock on the door of Filipino exchange student Corazon Amaro, ordering her and 2 other exchange students into the next room, where 3 more of their housemates lay asleep in their beds. After waking all of them up, Speck tied each of the 6 women's hands behind their backs using strips of torn bedsheets. Believing that they could keep him calm if they kept quiet and followed his directions, the women did not put up a fight, and complied with Speck's orders. It is possible that they thought he was simply there to rob them. However, Speck's intentions were far more sinister. Over the next 5 hours, he would go on a horrific rampage in the house, forcing the women to listen helplessly as each of their friends were brutally murdered. Speck carried out the attack by leading the women out of the room one by one. Once outside, he killed each through a combination of stabbing and strangulation. As the horrific attack dragged on, more women who lived in the dorm started to arrive home. They too became victims of the vicious attack. First was 21-year-old Susan Ferris, who was stabbed to death in the upstairs hallway while walking to her room. Next was 20-year-old Mary Ann Jordan, who was stabbed immediately after entering the house. The last woman to arrive, 22-year-old Gloria Jean Davy, also received the most brutal treatment. After being dropped off by her boyfriend late in the evening, she was sexually assaulted and brutalized before finally being strangled to death. Perhaps most disturbing of all, one woman managed to survive the unimaginable carnage of that night. While Speck was busy dealing with the women who arrived late to the dormitory, Corazon Amaru managed to slide under the bed in the room where the first group of women were being held. She held herself tightly to the wall, managing to remain unnoticed by Speck, who likely forgot how many women were originally in the house. She remained under the bed hours after the attack was over, only coming out the next morning after she was sure that the killer had left. Without the detailed description she was able to give investigators, it is impossible to know how long Speck might have remained on the run. Upon learning that police knew his identity, Speck attempted to commit suicide in a rundown motel, but was unsuccessful. He was identified at the hospital just 2 days after the crime, and later convicted for all 8 murders. He would spend the rest of his life in prison.
The murder of 14-year-old Bobby Franks by Nathan Leopold Jr. and Richard Albert Loeb has gained almost mythical status in the city of Chicago over the decades, not to mention the rest of the country. The 1920s murder case was not only characterized as the crime of the century when it happened, it has long since endured as a sort of morality tale about the hubris of those believing themselves intellectually superior enough to be above the law. Leopold and Loeb both came from extremely wealthy families in Chicago and distinguished themselves early in life through their educational achievements. Growing up in the Kentwood neighborhood of the city's South Side, they had known each other as children, eventually bonding over their shared sense of superiority and interest in crime while attending the University of Chicago. This fascination reportedly led the two to develop a secret romantic relationship, one that was characterized by breaking the law as a way to prove their love to each other. Though this criminal streak started with petty theft and vandalism, it eventually graduated to more serious crimes like arson, though these still did not satisfy the men's desires. In particular, Leopold and Loeb became obsessed with the idea of committing a crime that would generate significant media coverage, one for which they would never be caught. The men decided that their so-called perfect crime would be the kidnapping and murder of an adolescent boy, eventually settling on Loeb's cousin, Bobby Franks. After several months of planning, Leopold and Loeb were ready to put their plan into action. They would abduct and murder the teenager, dumping his body where it would not be found immediately. To partially hide the motive of their crime, they would demand a ransom, with complex instructions delivered by phone and ultimately ending with a note advising of the details of the money drop. The note would be written on a typewriter they had stolen while burglarizing a fraternity at the University of Michigan that they believed would not be traced back to them. If all went well, their perfect crime would allow them to commit their headline-generating murder and collect their money as well. However, Leopold and Loeb's plan unraveled almost immediately after they put it into motion. When they convinced Bobby Franks to get into their vehicle on the afternoon of May 21, 1924, they had miscalculated how hard it would be to knock the young boy out. As Loeb beat Franks with the blunt end of a chisel, the boy continued to fight, causing him to have to gag him with a length of cloth. This carelessness continued with the disposal of the body, when Leopold failed to notice that he dropped his glasses on the muddy ground near the culvert where they left Franks, 25 miles away from Chicago, in Hammond, Indiana. Though the men delivered their ransom note and made their first calls to the Franks family as planned, by the next morning the entire scheme had to be abandoned when the body of the 14-year-old boy was discovered. Things only got worse for Leopold and Loeb from there. The glasses found near the crime scene were eventually traced back to Leopold, and the men's alibi for the night of the murder quickly folded under police questioning. Both men eventually admitted to killing Franks, going as far as to tell police that they committed the crime purely for the thrill of it. The admission understandably drew intense interest from the public and the media, perhaps the only part of Leopold and Loeb's scheme that actually went according to plan. Along with the crime itself, perhaps the most famous part of the Leopold and Loeb story was their trial. Though the men both pled guilty, the trial was the subject of considerable publicity due to the men's lawyer, Clarence Darrow, using the case as a means to promote his arguments against capital punishment. The strategy worked, and both men were spared the death penalty in favor of life in prison. Over the years, the case has inspired various works of fiction, among them the 1948 Alfred Hitchcock film, Rope.
As with any case involving the killings of young people, it's not hard to understand why the unsolved murders of the Grimes sisters has continued to attract attention well beyond the Chicago area. On the night of December 28, 1956, 15-year-old Barbara Grimes and her 12-year-old sister Patricia went to a screening of the Elvis Presley film Love Me Tender. The Brighton Park Theater where the movie was playing was about 1.5 miles from the girls' family home on the southwest side of Chicago. It was an area Barbara and Patricia had traveled to on many occasions, having already seen the film 11 times previously. The girls left the house around 7:30 that evening, telling their mother Loretta they would be home just before midnight. When they failed to return by 2 o'clock the next morning, Loretta called the police. A citywide search for the missing girls quickly began. It would become one of the largest missing persons cases in the history of Chicago. Police conducted door-to-door canvassing in Brighton Park, dredged canals and rivers, and initiated a ground search aided by hundreds of local volunteers. More than 15,000 flyers were distributed in the area, and thousands of people were questioned in the case. Witnesses told investigators they had seen the girls at the theater on the night of their disappearance, but hadn't noticed any strange behavior or signs that the girls might be in trouble. The only exception was a statement from some witnesses who said they might have seen the girls getting into a vehicle of a young man who somewhat resembled Elvis Presley. The investigation turned up very few solid leads in the weeks following Barbara and Patricia's initial disappearance, with many assuming that the girls had simply run away from home or that they were staying with their boyfriends. This seemed to be backed up by several widely reported sightings of the girls in the days after they went missing. Though the Grimes family vehemently rejected this theory, they were largely ignored. It wasn't until nearly a month later that their worst fears would be proven correct. On January 22nd, a man driving on a country road in Willow Springs, Illinois, spotted something strange behind one of the road's guardrails. It turned out to be the nude, frozen bodies of Barbara and Patricia Grimes. Autopsies conducted on the bodies would lead to a significant amount of controversy in the case, as none of the three forensic pathologists could reach an agreement on either the time or manner of death. The most widely believed theory is that the Grimes sisters died just hours after their disappearance, as a result of secondary shock from the cold weather. The time of death was determined based on Barbara and Patricia's stomach contents. However, other pathologists in the case disagreed, finding signs of violent wounds and sexual contact, and concluding that the girls could have died much later. These discrepancies have never been definitively resolved. In addition to the problems identifying a time and cause of death, investigators discovered no real evidence at the location where the bodies were found. However, it is reported that law enforcement may have severely contaminated the crime scene by allowing volunteers and other untrained people to walk through the area. Though the police had several suspects in the case, including more than one who had confessed to the murders, they later recanted these confessions and said they were only given as a result of brutal police interrogation techniques. This seems to be true, as the prime suspect, Edward Bedwell, gave several inaccurate details in his confession that did not match existing evidence in the case. In the years since, unofficial investigations have pursued a possible link between the murder of the Grimes sisters and several other killings that happened in the city of Chicago around the same time. Despite this, the murders remain unsolved and continue to be one of the city's most notorious cases of all time.
Not only is John Wayne Gacy one of the most notorious serial killers ever to walk the streets of Chicago, he is one of the most prolific American serial murderers of all time. Of all the names on today's list, Gacy's name is probably the most instantly recognizable to most viewers, regardless of the extent to which they know about his terrible crimes. Like many serial killers, Gacy endured frequent abuse and belittlement at the hands of his alcoholic father while growing up. He also suffered from an unknown medical condition as a teenager that saw him hospitalized numerous times with seizures and blackouts. Gacy would later blame the bizarre condition and time spent in hospital for his failure to graduate high school. However, by the time Gacy entered his 20s, he appeared to be on track to live a completely normal adult life. By 1964, he had graduated from Northwestern Business College and married a woman named Marilyn Myers. The couple moved from Illinois to Waterloo, Iowa, where Gacy managed 3 KFC franchises purchased by Myers' parents. At the same time, he got further involved in a leadership training and civic organization called the United States Junior Chamber, or the JCs. It was during this time that Gacy would first exhibit signs of his horrific crimes to come. While managing the KFC restaurants, he set up a sort of club in his basement, where his teenage employees could play pool and drink alcohol. Though he employed both men and women at the restaurants, he only socialized with the teenage boys, often giving them excessive amounts of alcohol before making sexual advances. If the boys were not interested, Gacy would try to play his actions off like a joke. This pattern continued until 1967, when he sexually assaulted the son of one of his fellow JC members, 15-year-old Donald Voorhees. Gacy lured the boy back to his house with promises to show him pornography, and once there, sexually assaulted him. He had done this to several other teenagers, but unlike those other victims, Voorhees told his father about the assault. In December of 1968, Gacy was convicted for the sexual assault on Voorhees and given a 10-year sentence. During the proceedings, he was diagnosed as having antisocial personality disorder by 2 doctors, who said he was likely to continue to have run-ins with the justice system. Despite this, he was paroled after serving just 18 months of his sentence. Once released, Gacy went back to Chicago to live with his mother for a short time. While incarcerated, his wife had divorced him and taken sole custody of their 2 children and their property. Upon gaining his freedom, Gacy went back to sexually assaulting young boys almost immediately. Though he was arrested and charged for some of these crimes, he was never convicted, and the parole board in Iowa did not learn of the incidents. In October of 1971, Gacy's parole ended, leaving him free to escalate his crimes. With help from his mother, Gacy purchased the notorious ranch house in Norwood Park Township, which would become the scene of his grisly murders. During this time, he started a successful construction company, which he would use to attract teenage victims under the guise of well-paying jobs. He also joined the Jolly Joker Clown Club, where he would develop his infamous and terrifying characters named Pogo and Patches the Clown. Gacy's first known murder took place in 1972, with the killing of 16-year-old Timothy McCoy. He would later tell police that it was during this killing that he realized that, quote, death was the ultimate thrill. From here, Gacy's murderous appetite developed quickly, and he used a variety of methods to lure young men and boys to his house so he could rape and murder them. Sometimes he would pose as a police officer, other times he would use job offers at his company, and sometimes he would simply pick up unsuspecting victims from Chicago's Greyhound bus station, with the offer of a ride or a place to stay. Once there, Gacy would give his victims alcohol and offer to show them a magic trick as part of his clowning routine. The terrifying trick would begin by demonstrating how he could escape from a pair of handcuffs, after which he would ask the victim to try. Once locked up, Gacy would reveal his true intentions, proceeding to rape, torture, and eventually kill the young victim, usually via strangulation. He would then usually dump their bodies under the crawl space of his house. Gacy's unprecedented murder spree lasted until December 11, 1978, with the killing of 15-year-old Robert Peist. Gacy met Peist while discussing a remodeling deal with the owner of a pharmacy where the teenager worked. Like many other victims, Peist was lured to Gacy's house with the promise of a high-paying job with his construction company. When the teenager failed to return home, a missing persons report was filed with police. The pharmacy owner was questioned and was quickly able to lead investigators to Gacy. From there, it was only a matter of time before the discovery of Gacy's horrific crimes. A first search of the killer's property revealed many suspicious items, including weapons, handcuffs, police badges, sedative drugs, and a trove of pornography. Police also received a call from an employee of Gacy's, who advised them of several suspicious disappearances of his co-workers, and the fact that he had once been asked to pour quicklime under the crawl space of Gacy's home. Eventually, the killer cracked under police questioning and confessed to his crimes. At a trial in June of 1980, Gacy was found guilty of a total of 33 murders, the most of any individual in American history at the time. He was sentenced to death and was eventually executed in May of 1994. After his execution, his brain was famously removed in hopes that it could help scientists better understand the minds of serial killers. That brings us to the end of our list. Are there any other infamous Chicago murder cases that you think should have made our list? Tell us about them in the comments section below. As always, if you enjoyed our video, don't forget to like and subscribe to Crime Zone for more true crime content like this, making sure to hit the notification bell to stay up to date with our latest releases. Thank you for watching.